By 1941, the Wehrmacht's mobility relied on liquid fuel it could not afford to lose. As the campaign in the Soviet Union stretched across thousands of kilometers, gasoline shortages reached critical levels, supply convoys stalled, armored vehicles ran dry, and generators at field bases stopped operating. The German army's logistical backbone, its trucks and communication networks, depended on a steady supply of internal combustion energy that Germany's synthetic fuel plants could not sustain. In this crisis, army engineers searched for substitute fuels. Coal gasifiers were heavy, unreliable, and hazardous. Alcohol mixtures consumed grain that was already scarce. It was during this period that a small discovery from rural Poland appeared in local reports, a farmer's stupid trick, as an officer described it, that would soon become a large-scale logistical adaptation. The farmer, compelled to power his threshing machine without gasoline, used fermented potato mash. By sealing chopped potatoes, water, and yeast in a closed barrel, he produced a crude ethanol vapor that could be drawn through a filter of wood ash and burned in a simple gasifier tube. The output was weak but combustible. The contraption ran his equipment long enough to thresh grain during shortages. An army motor pool unit stationed nearby tested the idea with a modified generator engine. Against expectation, the motor ran for nearly 2 hours on the vapor from 3 barrels of fermented potatoes. The system was crude and inefficient, but it worked, and the ingredients were available in every village from Poland to Ukraine. By autumn 1941, this improvised Kartoffelgas experiment moved from curiosity to field adaptation. The idea spread through maintenance units desperate for fuel, and soon agricultural chemistry merged with military engineering. Out of rural improvisation emerged one of the most unexpected wartime innovations, a decentralized energy network fueled by rotting potatoes. As the advance into the Soviet Union continued, motor transport units began documenting more tests of the potato-based gasifier. The principle was simple. Potatoes, rich in starch, fermented rapidly in sealed containers. Within 48 hours, the mash produced ethanol vapors and carbon dioxide. When heated gently and passed through charcoal and lime filters, the vapor ignited in low compression engines. The first standardized field version used a converted 200-liter fuel drum. Mechanics installed an inner mash basket for chopped potatoes, added a water seal to manage pressure, and attached a steel tube leading to a charcoal purifier made from scrap piping. The purified vapor entered a modified carburetor where technicians widened jets and adjusted timing to accept the weaker fuel. The mixture was erratic, but once stabilized, engines ran at 40 to 55% of normal output, enough to move supply trucks, operate water pumps, power radio stations, or drive small tractors in depots. Reports from Army Group North recorded that a single barrel of fermenting potatoes could power a 3-kilowatt generator for 6 to 8 hours. This modest output had enormous implications: radio posts that would otherwise fall silent, maintained continuous communication, field hospitals kept sterilizers running, and repair stations powered lathes and welders. The key advantage was not performance, but availability. Potatoes grew everywhere across the occupied territories. They stored well, required little processing, and fermented reliably even in cold temperatures when mixed with yeast or grain residues. Military requisition teams began collecting spoiled or frozen potatoes, normally useless for food, and diverting them to gasifier units. Nothing edible was sacrificed, only waste was used. Engineers noted additional benefits. The mash byproduct, after fermentation, served as high-energy animal feed for horses. The system produced fuel and fodder simultaneously, both from the same raw material. By December 1941, potato-powered generators appeared in dozens of divisional logs. What began as a farmer's improvisation was becoming a tactical energy lifeline, primitive, slow, and smelly, but indispensable in a theater where conventional fuel arrived too late or not at all. By early 1942, the potato fermentation gasifier had spread far beyond the units that first improvised it. What began as an eccentric solution was now entering the attention of divisional logistics officers. Germany's oil shortages were worsening. Synthetic fuel plants were overstretched, and captured Soviet depots yielded little usable gasoline. Any method that could reduce dependence on liquid fuel, even marginally, gained institutional interest. Workshops across Army Groups Center and North began producing standardized Kartoffelgas assemblies. Trucks damaged beyond repair were stripped for sheet metal and piping. Their chassis became sources of raw material for field-made distillers. The design gradually stabilized into a two-stage system: a fermentation drum producing alcohol-rich vapor, a heated secondary chamber boosting vapor pressure and redirecting it through charcoal and lime filters. The device was mounted on small trailers that followed supply convoys, or remained stationed at command posts. These portable units could feed multiple engines by hose. A single trailer provided enough vapor to run 3 generators or 1 light truck at reduced speed. The energy output was modest, but the strategic value came from decentralization. Each battalion could produce fuel independently, without relying on vulnerable rail lines. Supply officers recorded that potato fuel reduced gasoline requirements for non-combat engines by up to 20% in some formations. This freed precious petroleum for armored units and reconnaissance vehicles. In siege sectors like Demyansk and Kolm, potato gas became critical. Surrounded garrisons powered their radios and emergency lighting with barrels of fermenting tubers dug from local cellars. The German medical service evaluated the process as well. Since edible potatoes were reserved for rations, fermentation used damaged stock, frozen, sprouting, or mold-affected. These were unsuitable for consumption, but ideal for starch breakdown. What had been agricultural waste became an energy reserve. Moreover, the gasifier solved an unexpected problem. Winter fuel thickening, traditional gasoline froze or lost volatility in deep cold. Potato vapor did not. It boiled at lower temperatures, allowing engines to start more reliably than on degraded fuel shipments. By spring 1942, the stupid trick had transitioned from rumor to doctrine. German command recognized that in a war of distances and scarcity, even primitive chemistry could become a force multiplier. The potato, a crop dismissed as peasant simplicity, had begun sustaining an industrial army stretched far beyond its supply capacity. By summer 1942, German occupation authorities formalized potato-based fuel production as part of the regional war economy. Civil administrators in Poland, Belarus, and western Ukraine issued requisition quotas for damaged or non-food-grade potatoes, directing them to military workshops instead of civilian disposal pits. Rural output, once measured only in calories, was now counted in cubic meters of potential vapor fuel. Field engineers established fermentation parks near rail junctions and supply hubs. Each park consisted of dozens of sealed barrels arranged in rows. Fermenting continuously, workers rotated batches every 2 days, ensuring a steady flow of vapor for gasifier trailers. A typical installation produced the energy equivalent of 150 to 200 liters of low-grade fuel per week. Insufficient for motorized offensives, but enough to power the static logistics that kept divisions alive: water pumps, radio relays, field kitchens, and machine shops. Army analysts conducted comparative studies. A hectare of potatoes yielded far less energy per unit weight than oil or coal, but unlike fossil fuels, potatoes could be harvested locally and did not require transport from Germany. The system was inefficient but self-contained, a crucial advantage on a front where every kilometer strained supply lines. Potato fuel did not win battles. It prevented collapse by powering the invisible backbone of the army. The energy cycle expanded further when mechanics discovered that leftover potato pulp, once fermented dry, served as effective starter fuel for improvised wood gas generators on larger trucks. The pulp burned hotter than raw wood and ignited more easily, reducing engine strain. Thus, the potato, fermented, distilled, and burned, became a multi-stage energy source with surprisingly high utility. Notably, the Soviets practiced no equivalent method at this stage of the war. Their fuel supplies were concentrated in state-managed depots, and rural improvisation remained limited due to strict collectivization. German units operating deep in the countryside, by contrast, exploited local knowledge to bypass their own failing industry. A peasant's trick had effectively compensated for a national shortage. By autumn 1942, millions of German soldiers indirectly relied on potato-based fuel, even if they never saw the barrels themselves. Radios that directed artillery fire, pumps that supplied clean water, and welders that repaired vehicles all drew power from fermenting tubers pulled from village cellars. The potato had become more than food. It was now a distributed energy infrastructure running parallel to the Reich's collapsing oil economy. an infrastructure born not from industrial planning but from the ingenuity of rural survival. By early 1943, the potato gas system had matured into a fully integrated auxiliary energy doctrine. What had begun as scattered field improvisation evolved into a structured component of German logistics planning. The Quartermaster General's office issued technical guidelines titled Vergärungsbrennstoff für Notaggregate, fermentation fuel for emergency power units. These instructions standardized mash composition, barrel size, filtration layers, and ignition procedures for engines running at reduced compression workshops across Army groups, North and Center, converted thousands of spare barrels into sealed fermentation units. Mobile repair companies carried dedicated kits containing yeast strains, pressure valves, charcoal filters, and spare tubing. The vapor's chemical consistency, once erratic, stabilized through repeated testing. The system became predictable. Each 200-liter drum produced enough usable vapor to drive a 15-horsepower utility engine for several hours. The doctrine now extended beyond energy generation. Engineers discovered that fermentation heat kept barrels above freezing, allowing them to double as warm storage for medical supplies and mechanical lubricants. Radio operators used small fermenters to prevent batteries from freezing inside dugouts. Field kitchens harnessed vapor burners to heat water when firewood was wet or scarce. The entire logistics chain adapted, integrating the potato's chemical potential into daily operations. The strategic value became obvious in attrition-heavy sectors at Rzhev, Vyazma, and Nevel, where road networks collapsed into mud. Gasoline deliveries were irregular or non-existent. Units that adopted potato fuel kept repair stations active even during isolation, meaning damaged weapons and vehicles returned to service instead of being abandoned. German operational records noted that divisions using fermentation power maintained up to 10 to 15% higher equipment readiness than formations relying solely on dwindling fuel shipments. Crucially, the system required no heavy transport. Mash barrels were produced locally, raw potatoes were collected from surrounding villages, and filtration materials came from charcoal, lime, and cloth, items already abundant in military stockpiles. It was logistics that generated itself from the landscape. By mid-1943, Allied intelligence intercepted reports of gas-producing food barrels, but misinterpreted them as battlefield rumors. No one outside the German logistical apparatus realized that the Wehrmacht had developed a distributed, self-replicating fuel chain hidden inside occupied farmland. The potato, ordinary, overlooked, and universally available, had become a strategic asset. It enabled machinery to run when oil fields, rail lines, and refineries failed. For a mechanized army fighting beyond its industrial horizon, the peasant's fermentation trick had turned into an institutional lifeline. By late 1943, German logistical analysts began studying potato-derived fuel with the same rigor applied to ammunition or petroleum. Supply officers compiled tables comparing fermentation output across regions. Fields in Belarus and western Ukraine produced high-starch varieties ideal for mash. Polish tubers fermented more slowly, but yielded cleaner vapor. The differences were measured, graphed, and distributed through internal memoranda. What had begun as rural improvisation was now treated as a measurable, predictable energy source. Agricultural officers estimated that 1 hectare of low-grade potatoes, unfit for human consumption, could produce enough fermentable biomass to generate the vapor equivalent of 300 to 350 liters of substandard gasoline. Though far weaker in energy density, the potato fuel was not subject to railway disruptions, refinery shortages, or Allied bombing. Each village was a microscopic energy reservoir that could not be interdicted from the air. This decentralization gave German rear units resilience disproportionate to the method's simplicity. In practice, potato fuel filled the gaps in the logistical system. Command posts used barrel gas generators to run field radios continuously, avoiding silent periods that had contributed to command breakdowns in 1941. Hospitals powered sterilizers and small heaters from mash-fed burners. Machine shops kept drill presses and welders operational during electrical outages. Analysts noted that even a minimal energy trickle prevented maintenance collapse, a factor more decisive than high-output fuel bursts. Veterinary units contributed unexpectedly. They found that horses fed with dried fermentation residue maintained weight better during severe cold. Thus, the same potato harvest powered engines, heated shelters, and sustained draft animals. Every component of the system fed another. the potato became a circulatory asset, linking energy, transport, and survival without ever relying on refineries. Reports from Army Group North evaluated the system's strategic effect. Units with steady mash production experienced fewer immobilized trucks, fewer radio outages, and higher recovery rates for damaged equipment. The cumulative result was a consistent operational tempo even under chronic fuel scarcity. The potato's value was no longer symbolic. It was mathematically proven. Mechanized warfare, built to run on petroleum, had quietly adapted to run on fermentation heat and vapor. A peasant's trick, once dismissed as absurd, had become a cornerstone of sustaining millions of soldiers across a front too vast for industry to support. By early 1944, the German army's operational endurance on the Eastern Front depended not only on remaining petroleum reserves, but on thousands of fermentation barrels quietly running behind the lines. The potato fuel network did not power tanks or aircraft. It powered everything that allowed those machines to exist at all. The system became most visible where its absence would have meant collapse. At frontline strongpoints, mash-fed generators kept radio links stable during Soviet offensives. Where gasoline-powered sets failed or froze, potato vapor sustained minimal voltage for hours. Command posts that once fell silent during supply delays could now coordinate artillery, infantry withdrawals, and night movements. The difference between communication and isolation often determined whether a division held or disintegrated repair battalions reaped the greatest benefit. A stable trickle of energy allowed welders, grinders, and battery chargers to function despite the disintegration of the rail-based fuel grid armored vehicles that would have been abandoned after breakdowns were restored and returned to combat. Field reports from several panzer divisions noted that potato-fueled workshops increased mechanical recovery rates by up to 25%. A hidden but decisive extension of combat strength, rear area water stations also depended heavily on fermentation power. Engines pumping groundwater for thousands of men ran on mash vapor during weeks when diesel shipments arrived too late or not at all. Without these pumps, entire sectors risked disease outbreaks. The potato fuel, weak but constant, prevented that breakdown. Even defensive construction benefited. Pioneer units used vapor-fed engines to run saws and compressors at positions where trees were scarce and gasoline rationed. As German forces shifted to defensive warfare, the ability to build fortifications at speed mattered more than vehicle mobility. Potatoes indirectly created bunkers, trenches, and wire obstacles that slowed Soviet advances. In strategic summaries from 1944, German logistics officers identified fermentation fuel as a stability multiplier. It did not increase striking power, it preserved continuity. Armies normally collapsed not from enemy action alone, but from the failure of communications, water, heating, and repair. The potato kept these invisible systems alive long after industrial capacity failed. Millions of soldiers endured the final year on these hidden calories of energy. The front did not hold because of tanks, doctrines, or miracles. It held because a rural fermentation trick, once mocked as primitive, became the last functioning layer of a collapsing logistical empire. By mid-1944, the potato fuel network began to unravel under the pressure of Germany's strategic retreat. As Soviet offensives pushed westward, the Wehrmacht abandoned vast agricultural zones that had supplied the starch-rich tubers essential for fermentation. Fermentation parks near Smolensk, Vitebsk, and Poltava were evacuated or destroyed. Barrels too heavy to move were burned, buried, or left fermenting in empty barns. The energy backbone that had supported millions was losing territory faster than it could adapt. Retreat disrupted the fermentation cycle itself. Potatoes required 2 to 3 days to produce usable vapor. Constant movement prevented stable batch rotation. Mobile units attempted to carry fermenting mash on wagons, but pressure fluctuations cracked seals and contaminated vapor lines. Output fell by half. Reports from July 1944 described severe inconsistency of emergency fuel, a technical understatement for a system collapsing under operational shock. Where the network persisted, its utility changed. Instead of powering workshops or radio nodes, potato vapor now served primarily for emergency heat. In the chaotic withdrawals through Belarus and Poland, field hospitals used mash burners to keep morphine fluid, prevent frostbite, and warm surgical tools. Machine shops no longer had time for full vehicle repairs, but vapor-fueled torches allowed crews to cut disabled equipment for evacuation or demolition. What had enabled endurance in 1942 to 43 now enabled survival in disintegration. Supply officers attempted to rebuild potato collection points in central Poland, but population displacement, scorched earth evacuations, and Allied bombing prevented sustained production. Potato harvests existed, but the structure required to convert them into fuel, barrels, workshops, stable logistics, had dissolved. Without infrastructure, the system returned to what it had been originally, scattered improvisation. Yet, even in decline, its impact remained measurable. During the retreat from Ukraine, several divisions reported that potato fuel generators maintained radio contact for 72 hours after gasoline stocks ran dry. In the Warsaw sector, mash-powered pumps kept water flowing during encirclements. These local successes demonstrated the system's resilience even as the larger framework collapsed. The potato fuel network was not defeated by technology or enemy adaptation but by geography. Its strength, decentralization, could not survive when the army itself lacked stable ground. As the Wehrmacht lost its agricultural hinterland, it lost the soil that fed its biological energy chain. The stupid trick had carried Germany farther than its industry ever could, but by late 1944, retreat robbed it of the one thing it could not replace: land. By early 1945, the potato fuel system existed only in fragments, scattered across an army in full retreat. Fermentation barrels appeared in truck columns fleeing Silesia, in barns near Königsberg, and in makeshift dugouts along the Oder. The organized network that once powered hundreds of generators had devolved into isolated pockets of improvisation. Yet, even in its dying phase, it continued to sustain German units in ways no conventional fuel system could. What remained of the potato supply came from civilian stores in East Prussia and Pomerania. Refugee flows mixed with Wehrmacht remnants, and soldiers bartered protection for sacks of spoiled potatoes. Improvised gasifiers reappeared everywhere, mounted on wagons, hidden in cellars, patched with rags and wire. In many encircled towns, they provided the only source of heat. Fermentation vapor warmed first aid posts, melted snow for drinking water, and prevented medical supplies from freezing during bombardments. Logistical diaries from February 1945 describe microgrids forming spontaneously. One generator powering a field phone exchange, another running a small pump, a third feeding dim lights in command dugouts. Even 1 hour of vapor-fueled electricity was enough to coordinate retreats, repair radios, or transmit last-minute orders. In a war dominated by mechanized collapse, the potato kept pockets of organization alive. In the bunker complexes of the Vistula sector, engineers used mash burners to heat lubricants so that machine gun mounts and artillery recoil systems would not seize in sub-zero cold. Small advantages gained through fermentation heat delayed mechanical failure during critical defensive moments. The potato, no longer a widespread energy asset, had become a survival tool. The final strategic contribution was psychological rather than material. Soldiers accustomed to chronic shortages found in the potato fuel a dependable, familiar resource, something they could produce themselves without waiting for impossible supply convoys. The last field reports emphasized this autonomy. We can still generate power locally. In an army losing the ability to move, communicate, or coordinate, the potato remained one of the few things that still obeyed human effort. By March 1945, the system was effectively gone, erased by lost territory and total collapse of infrastructure. But until its final day, the peasant's trick continued to supply sparks of energy that prolonged functionality in a disintegrating front. In the ruins of a mechanized war, the last engines that turned, the last lights that flickered, and the last radios that sputtered often did so because of fermenting potatoes. When the war ended in May 1945, the potato fuel system vanished from official records almost overnight. Fermentation barrels rotted in abandoned barns, improvised gasifiers were scrapped for metal or burned to heat refugee shelters. No medals, commendations, or studies publicly acknowledged the system's role. Yet in classified Allied assessments of captured documents, analysts recognized that Germany's logistical endurance in 1942-44 depended in part on this strange rural energy web. Technical examination confirmed that the chemistry behind Kartoffelgas had been sound. Ethanol-rich vapor, when heated and filtered, produced a combustible mixture suitable for low-compression engines. The system's strength was not in efficiency but in autonomy. It operated without refineries, electrical grids, or long-distance transport. It turned agricultural waste into mechanical output, something industrial fuel systems could not do under bombardment. Post-war agricultural and engineering institutes quietly adopted elements of the method. Eastern European farms reused fermentation heat to warm storage cellars. Humanitarian agencies in the early Cold War experimented with mash-fueled microburners for remote field hospitals. Even small-scale distillation units used in rural electrification projects bore conceptual resemblance to the wartime mash barrels. For German veterans, the memory survived as anecdote. Barrels bubbling behind command posts, the sweet smell of fermenting potatoes in winter, crude hoses feeding sputtering engines that powered lights, radios, or pumps. They understood intuitively what documents rarely stated outright. The potato had kept their world functioning when the industrial machine behind them collapsed. In broader historical terms, the episode revealed a fundamental truth about total war, that technological superiority can be undermined by vulnerability in logistics, and that resilience often emerges not from advanced machinery, but from the ability to convert local biological resources into usable energy. The farmer's stupid trick was not a miracle. It was an accidental convergence of chemistry, agriculture, and desperation. It proved that even a mechanized army could survive, temporarily, on the metabolism of a tuber. And in the vast ledger of the Eastern Front, where millions depended on systems too fragile for the realities of distance and winter, a trick born in a village workshop quietly reshaped the operational lifespan of an entire army. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more WW2 stories.